The sky seems like the most free place. But behind the tranquility of commercial flights lurks a dark conspiracy. On a Horizon airline flight, Tony, a young flight attendant, not only faces the challenges of his job but also uncovers a shocking truth. A drug trafficking ring is exploiting commercial flights to transport illegal goods. The first sign, a special passenger. It all began when Mr. Sanchez, a powerful first-class passenger, boarded the plane with an arrogant and authoritative demeanor. He was not only rude to Tony but also treated like royalty on the flight. From the flight crew to the other passengers, everyone showed him deference. Tony, with his keen instincts, noticed the anomaly of Sanchez wielding almost absolute power on this flight. Even Captain Ryan maintained a diplomatic attitude when dealing with him. The suspicions grew stronger when Tony accidentally witnessed a mysterious exchange between Sanchez and another passenger. During a brief moment when Sanchez requested wine, Tony noticed a small envelope being secretly passed, almost hidden beneath a napkin. When Tony's eyes glanced over, Sanchez immediately became wary and gave him a threatening look. Mystery in the luggage hold. It wasn't just Sanchez's suspicious behavior. Tony also noticed something odd about the luggage handling. A special piece of luggage was loaded into the VIP hold without a thorough inspection. When Tony asked a colleague about the item, the other flight attendant simply shook their head and said, "That's not your concern. Don't get involved." The evasive answer made Tony even more suspicious. He remembered the warnings from his sister, Laura, a DEA agent, that this air route had been under investigation for drug trafficking activities. And now, he was seeing signs that it might still be happening. Warning from Laura. As soon as the flight landed, Tony reached out to Laura to tell her what he'd seen. She listened with a tense expression, then lowered her voice. "Tony, you need to stay away from this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Laura revealed that the DEA had been monitoring Horizon airline flights for some time and suspected that a transnational drug trafficking ring was using the airline to transport contraband. She warned Tony that Sanchez wasn't just some low-level smuggler. He could be a key figure in the organization. But for Tony, this wasn't just a DEA case, it was also a chance for him to find out the truth about his father's death. His dad used to be an investigator and had died mysteriously on the same air route. If the smuggling ring was still operating, it was very likely that his father's death was related. Taking risks to find answers. Despite his sister's warning, Tony decided to continue his investigation his own way. He began observing the flights and regular passengers more closely. One of the things he noticed was that there was always a group of VIP customers who appeared on the same routes. And they never seemed to go through rigorous security checks. One day, while cleaning up after a flight, Tony accidentally found a small bag left behind in the luggage hold. When he opened it, he was shocked to find small bags of white powder inside, an unmistakable sign of drugs. A feeling of dread washed over him. But at the same time, Tony knew that he had stumbled upon a dangerous secret. But before he could report it to Laura, Tony discovered something even more terrifying. Someone knew about his snooping. On his desk in the flight attendant lounge, a small note was left with a scribbled message. "Knowing too much isn't good for you." Walking in the shadows, Tony understood that there was no turning back. He was being watched, and if he kept investigating, his life could be in danger. But at the same time, this was his only chance to find out the truth about his father's death. Could Tony expose the high-altitude drug smuggling scheme? Who was really behind Sanchez? And why had Horizon Airline been turned into a drug transport route? Most importantly, was the truth about Tony's father's death connected to this crime ring? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was certain. Tony had stepped into a dangerous world where every mistake could cost him his life. Same-sex love and inner turmoil, a fateful flight. Love can blossom anywhere, in small roadside cafes, amidst the bustling crowds of the city, or even at 30,000 feet, where the sky stretches endlessly and secrets are hard to hide forever. For Tony, being a flight attendant wasn't just a job but also part of his plan, a plan to uncover the truth about his father's death. But what he didn't expect was to be swept up in a whirlwind of emotions with Ryan Rossi, the captain of the flight, a strong, ambitious man who also harbored an invisible fear, the fear of being judged, the fear of losing everything he had built, fleeting glimpses and a racing heart. From the first time Tony met Ryan, He felt an intense attraction to the man. Ryan wasn't just handsome in the charming way of an airline captain, the impeccable uniform, the sharp eyes, the confident demeanor, but there was also something elusive about him. He had a cold exterior but seemed to be hiding secrets inside. The brief moments on the flight, the fleeting eye contact, the seemingly meaningless small talk made Tony's heart pound. He sensed something from Ryan, an internal struggle, a repression, but Ryan never revealed anything. At least not until one fateful night. A secret revealed. After a long flight, Tony accidentally walked into Ryan's hotel room unannounced. The scene before him surprised him. Ryan was sitting alone by the window, looking out at the night sky with troubled eyes. When he saw Tony, he startled slightly, but then tried to regain his usual composure. "I think you have the wrong room," Ryan said, his voice trembling slightly. But Tony wasn't mistaken. He had received a message from a dating app with this room number, and the sender of that message, by all indications, was Ryan. "You sent me the message, didn't you?" Tony asked, slowly stepping forward. Ryan was silent for a long moment. Then, as if he couldn't keep it inside any longer, he sighed and nodded. "But it was a mistake," Ryan said, his voice full of confusion. "I shouldn't have done that." Tony looked straight into Ryan's eyes, recognizing the fear hidden behind the tough facade. "A mistake? Or are you just scared?" The internal struggle. Ryan didn't answer right away. He turned away, as if trying to hide the truth about himself. "Tony, you don't understand. I can't. I've worked too hard to get to this position. If anyone finds out, I could lose everything. They won't respect me anymore. I can't let that happen." Tony chuckled softly, but it wasn't a mocking laugh, but rather one of sympathy. "You think I don't understand? I've been scared too. I've hidden from myself. But I've learned one thing: if you can't be true to yourself, then what's the point of everything you've achieved?" Ryan clenched his fists, his eyes full of conflict. "Not everyone is as brave as you, Tony. Not everyone is as cowardly as you." Tony's words shook Ryan. He knew Tony was right. But to step out of the shell, to face the truth, would he dare to make that trade? One step forward, one fear. That night, for the first time in his life, Ryan allowed himself to be real. They shared a kiss, awkward but intense, as if they were both seeking release. But the very next morning, Ryan panicked again. He treated Tony as if nothing had happened, trying to go back to being his old self. Tony wasn't surprised, but he couldn't hide his disappointment either. "You can keep pretending, Ryan, but I won't be the one waiting for you forever." Ryan wanted to say something, but then he fell silent. He knew Tony was right, but how could he step into the light when he had been accustomed to the darkness all his life? The choice. Ryan could continue to live with his shell, holding on to his career and reputation, or he could accept the truth, face the world, and accept who he really was. Tony didn't want to pressure Ryan, but he couldn't be with someone who didn't dare to seize their own happiness. Would Ryan be brave enough to change? Or would he let fear imprison him forever? The answer remained unclear. But one thing was certain: amidst the vast sky, where the truth is hard to hide forever, Ryan would soon have to make his choice. Revenge and personal investigation, the journey to find the truth. Tony never believed in accidental deaths, especially not the death of his father, a veteran investigator who had died mysteriously on the very flight that he now served. From a young age, Tony had been accustomed to seeing his father working tirelessly, fighting against the dark forces to protect justice. But then one day, he boarded a flight and never returned. There was no reasonable explanation, no answers, only a brief announcement: an accident, an incident of unknown cause. But Tony knew better than anyone: his father wasn't someone who could be easily defeated. If he died on that flight, there had to be a conspiracy behind it. And now, with the opportunity to stand on that very route, Tony was determined to find out the truth. The first clues. Laura, Tony's sister and also a DEA agent, had repeatedly warned him to stay away from the case. "You think the DEA hasn't investigated? You think Dad didn't know who he was dealing with? Don't become the next victim, Tony." But for Tony, that wasn't enough. Laura's warnings only made him more determined. He started observing the passengers, the luggage, and even the flight crew. One thing he quickly realized: there were people who always appeared on certain flights. One of them was Mr. Sanchez, the powerful man whom even Captain Ryan had to treat diplomatically. He didn't seem like an ordinary passenger. Luggage being loaded into the VIP hold without security checks. Brief but tense meetings with shadowy figures. All were suspicious signs. Entering a dangerous investigation. Unable to stand by and observe any longer, Tony decided to act. On a night flight, when the passengers were sound asleep, he quietly entered the luggage hold. He searched through the suspicious items. And finally, he found something that made his heart pound. A bag containing a large number of small white packets. He knew exactly what he was seeing. And he also knew that if his father had found this before, that was the reason he was killed. But just as Tony was about to leave, a voice rang out behind him. "What are you doing here, Tony?" He turned around. It was John Blackwood, another flight attendant, whom he had thought was an ordinary colleague. But his eyes were no longer as gentle as before. "I'm just checking the cargo." Tony tried to stay calm. "Is that so?" John stepped closer, his voice cold. "I think you're going too far. And believe me, if you continue, you'll meet the same fate as your father." The words were like a knife stabbing into Tony's mind. Betrayal and secrets revealed. Tony realized that he had underestimated John. He wasn't just a flight attendant. He was part of this crime ring. And more importantly, he knew the truth about his father's death. But before Tony could react, John struck. A powerful punch to the stomach knocked Tony down, his breath catching in his throat. "You can't stop this, Tony. This is a much bigger system than you think." He bent down, whispering in his ear, "And if you keep going, you won't get a chance to land." Escaping and seeking allies. Tony knew that he couldn't face this alone. When the flight landed, he quickly reached out to Laura. He knows about Dad. He knows what happened. But instead of panicking, Laura just shook her head. "Tony, don't you understand? We're dealing with a network that's too big. They have people on the inside. They can kill anyone without anyone questioning it. So what do we do?" Tony asked, his voice full of determination. Laura stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "We need a plan. The enemy appears." But Tony didn't have time. As he left the hotel, a black car suddenly blocked his way. A group of people got out, and standing before him was none other than Mr. Sanchez. "You've gone too far, kid," he said with a cold smile. Before Tony could react, everything went dark. The price of truth. When Tony woke up, he found himself tied to a chair. In a dark room, in front of him were John Blackwood, the man who had betrayed him, and Mr. Sanchez. "Your father was as stubborn as you," Sanchez sneered, "but he had to give in too. You think you can do differently?" Tony swallowed hard. He knew that he had entered a war where the price to pay could be his own life. But he also knew that if this was the only opportunity to find out the truth about his father's death, he wouldn't back down. Could Tony escape? Who was really behind this crime ring? And more importantly, what was the truth about his father's death? The answers were still waiting ahead. But one thing was certain. Tony wouldn't stop until he had discovered everything. End of the journey, truth, love, and choice. Tony felt a sharp pain shoot through his body as he opened his eyes. The dim lights on the ceiling weren't enough to illuminate the faces of the people in front of him. But Tony didn't need to see to know who was there. Mr. Sanchez, John Blackwood, the people who had tried to hide the truth about this drug trafficking ring. About his father's death. Tied to the iron chair, Tony felt the rope tightening around his wrists. But what pained him most wasn't the wounds on his body, but the fear in his heart. Was this the end for him? Was he following in his father's path? A fight for justice ending in darkness without anyone knowing? The final choice. Sanchez stepped closer, his cold eyes scanning Tony like a predator eyeing its prey. "You thought you were so smart, huh?" He smiled faintly. "You thought you could play detective and topple us? Just like your father, Tony. He used to think like that too. And then what happened?" Tony's heart sank. His voice rang out like a knife stabbing straight into his memory. "He didn't give up," Tony said, his voice weak but firm. "And you think you can do differently?" Sanchez raised his eyebrow. "You want to die like him?" Tony smirked, even as pain spread throughout his body. "No, I don't want to die. I want to see you pay." His challenge made Sanchez laugh. But at that moment, a loud explosion rang out outside the door. The door burst open. Laura and the DIA Special Forces rushed in. Guns pointed straight at Sanchez and his accomplices. "Freeze! Hands on your heads now!" Laura yelled. John Blackwood, the man who had threatened Tony, immediately raised his hands in surrender. But Sanchez wasn't going to give up so easily. He pulled out a gun, aiming it straight at Tony. Everything happened in an instant. A gunshot went off. Tony closed his eyes instinctively. But when he opened them, he saw Sanchez collapse, blood flowing on his shirt. Laura had acted first. He stared at Tony, his eyes filled with hatred. Before falling completely, the room went silent. There was only Tony's gasp and the sound of boots on the ground as the DEA team subdued the rest. He had survived, but more importantly, he had completed his father's mission. Facing the truth, Tony sat in his hotel room, looking out the window. The night scene spread out before him, but in his heart, there were no longer the storms of doubt and fear. Laura walked in, her eyes still as cold as ever. But Tony could see the relief hidden inside. "Dad would be proud of you," she said, putting a hand on his shoulder. Tony didn't say anything, just nodded slightly. His father hadn't died in vain. The truth had been exposed. But there was still one thing unanswered. "Where's Ryan?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Laura sighed. "He's waiting for you." Ryan's choice. Tony found Ryan at the hotel bar, a half-finished drink in front of him. When Tony approached, Ryan didn't turn around right away. But Tony knew that Ryan had recognized his presence. "You thought I didn't survive?" Tony teased, trying to break the tension. Ryan sighed, then turned around, his eyes filled with emotions that Tony couldn't read. "I was afraid," Ryan said, simply but sincerely. Tony pulled out a chair and sat down facing him. "Afraid of what?" Ryan smiled slightly, but in that smile was a whole lot of pain. "Afraid of losing you, and afraid of losing myself." Tony looked straight into Ryan's eyes. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." Silence hung between them. Then Ryan took a deep breath. "I resigned." Tony stopped. "What?" Ryan looked out the window, his voice softer. "I don't want to live in a box anymore. Tony, don't want to live a life where I always have to hide who I really am. I've been thinking about this all my life. But you made me realize that no one can run away from the truth forever." Tony held his breath. He didn't expect Ryan to make this decision. But he knew that this wasn't just because of him, it was also for Ryan himself. Ryan turned back, his eyes now devoid of fear. "I want a new beginning. And I want you by my side." Tony laughed, a real laugh after months of weariness. "You really thought I would let you go alone?" Ryan didn't say anything, just smiled. And then, without another word, he pulled Tony into a tight embrace. Lessons in liberation. They had spent too long hiding the truth, to run away from themselves. But eventually, they had found the path they really wanted to take. Tony had completed his goal. He had brought justice to his father, exposed the truth that so many had tried to hide. But more importantly, he had found his own happiness. And Ryan, who had been afraid, who had struggled with himself, had finally dared to make a choice. A choice not just to love, but to live true to himself. In this life, there are things we can lose. There are people who leave us forever. But truth, courage, and love, those are things that can never be defeated. They had taken too long to figure that out. But from now on, they would never let it slip away again.